Thank you. First of all, I must take my hat off to Joe Mulholland too for having negotiated a secret agreement with Britain's Director of Public Prosecutions to announce the phone hacking charges just to coincide with the McGill Summer School. Just to give my contribution a topical peg. Thank you, Joe. There was a second happy coincidence, really, because the charges were announced on the same day that the Leveson inquiry, our own British form of tribunal, terminated its oral hearings. And it's been an amazing feat over a 9-month period to take a mixture of written and oral evidence from 650 witnesses, including me. Leveson's central task is to recommend to the British government a new form of press regulation, which is causing palpitations in British newspapers, and it could have, I think, implications across the rest of the world, because a lot of press regulation in other countries is based around current British press regulation. And it's not an exaggeration to say that press freedom in Britain hangs in the balance, and therefore so does democracy. Now, I noted in the programme notes that it stated that most fair-minded people will have been shocked over the past months to listen to the revelations coming out of the Leveson inquiry. In fact, fair-minded people have heard nothing yet. I'm sure they'll be even more shocked at the intimate details of crimes when people come to trial. And once those trials have concluded, what the Guardian's heroic investigative journalist Nick Davis knows that no one else, that he's not able to report. Despite a total of more than 80 arrests, we can't be sure that the Crown Prosecution Service will take them all to court. And indeed, some of the arrested people will never be charged. But the announcement on Tuesday that 8 people are to be charged is hugely significant. Yet another landmark moment in a saga which has had so many landmark moments. So let me begin by just repeating the latest facts. 8 people, including the former News International Chief Executive and the former Government Communications Director, Andy Coulson, have been charged on 19 counts involving the hacking of more than 600 people. Andy Coulson, faces 5 counts of conspiracy to intercept communications without lawful authority during his editorship of the News of the World, and Rebekah Brooks, his predecessor as editor, who went on to be chief executive, faces 3 counts. 5 of the paper's former senior staff face similar charges, as does the private investigator who was contracted to the paper, Glenn Mulcair. I ought also to mention that Rebekah Brooks, her husband, her PA, her chauffeur, and 2 News International security men also face trial for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. And Andy Coulson has been charged in Scotland with perjury. Now, I'm not going to refer to these people again because despite speaking here in a different jurisdiction, I'm very conscious of the fact that I mustn't say anything at all that would prejudice them obtaining a fair trial. Brooks's lawyers have already made it very clear that they be making a legal submission in future on that matter. Similarly, with many people on police bail, good legal sense must prevail. But the very fact that I began in this fashion is an indication of the seriousness of what is generally known as the phone hacking scandal. In fact, we know it goes wider now than merely the interception of mobile phone voicemail messages. It deals with computer hacking and with illegal payments to the police and other public officials, including even members of the military. And it even goes wider than the now defunct News of the World, because journalists on other papers have also been arrested. Consider the scale of this scandal. Within just a couple of weeks last year, this month last year, July last year, it brought about the resignation of Britain's highest-ranking policeman and one of his senior aides. It prompted the resignation of 2 News Corporation executives. It saw the beginning of that string of arrests, and it caused the closure of Britain's largest selling Sunday newspaper. It resulted in News Corp being forced to withdraw from one of the largest ever media deals in the world, and it forced an embarrassed Prime Minister to institute an unprecedented judicial inquiry into the standards and practice of the entire British press under Lord Justice Leveson. Just a couple of weeks in 1 month. Then consider what's happened in the 12 months since. This necessarily brief overview is going to include some facts and figures, but I do that to illustrate the gravity of the scandal. There are 4 separate and overlapping Metropolitan Police investigations, one into phone hacking, Operation Wheating, with 96 police staff and 24 arrests to its name. A second into computer hacking called Operation Tulita, staffed by 19 officers, and last Thursday a Sun reporter became the 7th person to be arrested in that inquiry alone. Third operation, Operation Elvedon, staffed by 70 officers, investigating allegations of inappropriate payments by journalists to police and public officials, 41 arrests of journalists in that case. And that's being overseen by the Independent Police Complaints Commission. The fourth operation, Operation Calmic, which we didn't even know existed until the Metropolitan Police Deputy Assistant Commissioner revealed its existence in front of Leveson in February this year. That's an offshoot of the computer hacking inquiry, and it has a Northern Ireland angle because it involves a former British Army intelligence officer known as Martin Ingram or Ian Hurst. And one person's been arrested for that too. Then there's a Scottish police investigation, Operation Rubicon, in which 50 officers are looking into allegations of phone hacking, breach of data protection, and perjury. So let me do the maths in all of that. A total of 235 British police officers staffing 5 major criminal investigations have arrested 83 people, of whom 15 have so far been charged. It is fair to say that British journalists have crossed a Rubicon. Meanwhile, with the police finally being forced to hand information to people whose phones were hacked by the News of the World, the civil courts have been very busy indeed. Many, many thousands of pounds have been paid out to victims. 100,000 to Sienna Miller, the actress, 20,000 to the football pundit Andy Gray, thousands to a whole string of politicians, footballers, wives of footballers, sportsmen, actors, singers, the parents, stars, secretaries and agents, the mother of a London 7/7 tube bombing victim, a 7/7 hero, Paul Dadge, Sean Russell, a man who was grieving husband of a murdered wife, his phone hacked, and several other bereaved people. By March this year, News International had settled 55 claims and paid already before that £2 million to the family of the murdered girl Millie Dowler. Previously paid £1 million to the agent Max Clifford, £700,000 to Gordon Taylor, chairman of the Professional Footballers Association. More than 50 actions are still being pursued. David Beckham's father, Wayne Rooney, Cherie Blair. And there will be more. There will be more. The final compensation bill for Rupert Murdoch's company, just in this aspect, will be probably in the region of 200 million. Even so, 5 police operations, is that justifiable? You could be forgiven for thinking that the police activity is overkill and largely the result of the intense embarrassment of the Metropolitan Police in having failed to deal properly with the hacking affair when it first broke cover 6 years ago. And if my information is correct, then it's fair to say that some people who've been arrested may not deserve the ignominy. But whether or not charges are brought in every case, we can't escape the conclusion that many journalists have been guilty of grossly inappropriate behaviour. Now, I'm relieved, as I'm sure you are, that this scandal has not embraced this country. Despite the fact that UK newspapers are sold here, there's been no evidence of illegal behaviour among the scribes in Dublin. That isn't to say there won't be implications for papers here, but I've spent enough time living in this country, indeed living in this county, that I can feel confident about the central reason for the cleanness of Ireland's journalists. That doesn't mean they don't make mistakes, doesn't mean they don't get things wrong, but they've not indulged, it would appear, in illegal activity. To do so, I echo the remarks made 3 weeks ago at the Leveson inquiry by this country's, I'm sorry, he's going to apologise and make him embarrassed, this country's excellent press ombudsman, John Horgan, in which he suggested that Ireland's culture is different from Britain's in terms of a greater respect for privacy. And privacy intrusion is the central feature of all that's happened in Britain. So in order to grasp how this extraordinary state of affairs came about, I want to take you back briefly into UK press history. It may then understand that cultural difference Professor Horgan mentioned. Overarching everything else are two inescapable facts. First, the London-based British national press is the world's most competitive. It's been marked throughout its history, right back to the beginning of the 20th century, by intense rivalry between publishers and owners, editors, especially of popular papers, whose major preoccupation has been to build circulations in the belief that size of audience provides them with a mixture of political, social, cultural, and commercial influence. First thing. Second, for the best part of 30 years, the 20 or so titles, 10 dailies roughly and 10 Sundays, they change sometimes over the years, have been suffering from declining sales. And that decline has accelerated in the past 10 years, not least because of the advance of digital technology. Added to that is the fact that advertising revenue has fallen off a cliff due to the recession and due to the migration to the internet. This has given rise to a cliché that the newspaper business model has been wrecked by a perfect storm. Now, it would be overly simplistic to say that this dire commercial reality is the reason for editorial misbehaviour on the scale I'm about to describe, but it undoubtedly has played a role in the way in which publishers, notably Rupert Murdoch, were prepared to turn a blind eye to ethical standards in order to maximise sales and profits, of course, of their newspapers. Now, I'm not naive. I was assistant editor of The Sun for 5 years. I edited the Daily Mirror, and before that, I worked for all the other popular papers. So I know from the inside how the business works, or once worked. Down the years, I became aware that journalists got up to all sorts of tricks to obtain stories, some of which might be regarded as unethical, and some even illegal. Reporters who dressed up in white coats to get into hospital wards, reporters who offered public officials money, reporters who blagged information. That's tricking people, bureaucrats on the phone, sub-editors who invented or bent quotes, bowing to instructions usually from bosses, photographers who trespassed in order to obtain candid pictures, journalists who routinely, casually, intruded into privacy or grief. And, of course, editors who demanded that those things happened or at least turned a blind eye to their occurrence. And it's important to take on board at this point when you think about journalists doing with their bidding, newspapers are not democracies. They are simply autocracies in which the publisher's and the editor's word is law. So it's obvious that publishers and editors couldn't really be unaware of their journalists' boundary testing activities, even if they were ignorant of the specifics involved. They can't possibly have been shocked, to be honest, by most of the Leveson revelations. Nor were those activities considered to be a matter of genuine concern by those who carried them out. In fairness, there might have been a public interest justification for some of those tactics, though it has to be said that newspapers have stretched to breaking point that particular justification, not least because of a growth of celebrity culture. Indeed, we live, sadly, in an age of celebrity, and that forms another key part of this story. Celebrity journalism is ethically suspect for all sorts of reasons. Truth is a moving target, unscrupulous back-scratching deals are done between journalists and agents and PRs, and the boundary between what is properly public and what it should be properly private is totally blurred. Celebrities are, in the end, simply circulation fodder. Celebrity journalism's ambiguous ethos has bred, unfortunately, a journalistic approach and agenda that has infected all other kinds of journalism too, on non-celebrity matters, including politics. And similarly, journalists' hard-edged methods have to be viewed in terms of Britain's culture of secrecy, where it is still, and even in these more transparent times, difficult to obtain even fairly harmless, trivial information. Indeed, with the growth of what we might call the public relations industry, it's arguably more difficult to get at the truth. It's a sobering thought that there are now more PRs in Britain than there are journalists. And in response, journalists have grown used to using what might be called shortcuts. Within newspapers, some of the dodgier methods employed by reporters are largely the subject of comic repartee by their practitioners. In the pubs of Fleet Street, reporters love to regale each other with tales of dubious exploits, often embroidered and exaggerated, of course. I need to stress that journalists are as much myth-makers about their own trade as they are myth-makers in print when talking to their readers. It's an important point because it explains the journalist's defensiveness since the scandal broke and the widespread hostility in newsrooms towards the Leveson inquiry. They genuinely can't see what is all the fuss about. Few, it is fair to say, wouldn't defend phone hacking and computer hacking openly, but they believe it was a minority sport by a clutch of bad eggs rather than a major indictment of their trade. Unlike the public, and the public have taken a different view to journalists on this, they've largely scorned the evidence presented to Leveson. I'll come back to that. Not what we have heard from us. So what we have heard from a succession of witnesses since Leveson's hearings, listen to this. A number of celebrities, Hugh Grant, Sienna Miller, Charlotte Church, have told intrusions into their privacy. The author, J.K. Rowling, told of living under a siege by media. Those same charges were made with much greater effect and arousing much more sympathy by people who were suddenly and accidentally thrust into the limelight, notably Kate and Jerry McCann, whose 3-year-old daughter Madeline disappeared while they were on a holiday in Portugal, and by Christopher Jeffries, an innocent man, a nice man, an intelligent man, defamed simply because he happened to be the landlord of a murdered woman. And then Millie Dowler's parents, Bob and Sally. So their stories really galvanized Leveson. Politicians, we know some of them are considered to be hard-edged, but including government ministers, told of being intimidated, and some revealed they'd been the subject of lengthy surveillance operations. I have to say, in all my years as a journalist, I didn't know that journalists would go on lengthy, week-long surveillance operations. Only the other day, one of the last witnesses to Leveson was a man who runs a photographic agency who carried out 330 surveillance operations on behalf of the People newspaper mostly, sometimes the News of the World, in just 2 years. 330 people followed day after day. Then there were the journalists who decided to turn what we might call Queen's evidence and speak out about the reality of working in these regimes, notably a man called Richard Pepiat, who worked at the Daily Star, and then another man, Matt Driscoll, who was fired from the News of the World after prolonged bullying. And it shows you how bad that was that an employment tribunal granted him £800,000 in compensation. Just as astonishing was the evidence from a cavalier News of the World deputy features editor, Paul McMullen, who set out to justify intrusions into privacy by saying that privacy was only for paedophiles, an astonishing piece of evidence. Along the way, we heard from editors who, in the main, were prepared to defend their newspaper records. Oh, it's always somebody else that does these things. It's just a small gang, the News of the World. You'd have thought butter didn't melt in their mouths. Along the way, there were great set-piece moments at Leveson, the appearances of Rupert Murdoch, James Murdoch, Rebecca Brooks, Andy Coulson, and just as sensationally, the Prime Minister himself, David Cameron, and the Cabinet Minister responsible for the media, Jeremy Hunt. In setting up the Leveson inquiry, Cameron could never have imagined that he would end up, in front of the inquiry he set up, being cross-examined about his own ethics and his unwise hiring of Andy Coulson as his director of communications, and his relationship with the Murdoch organization, and the reasons that he'd gone out riding with Rebecca Brooks on the police horse she'd borrowed from the Metropolitan Police, and explaining how he'd signed off text messages to her LOL, which he thought meant lots of love, and it doesn't. But that takes us to the essential. I knew I'd get there. I'll be very. I'm taking two.
No, you're proud.
No, there's another 3 hours to go. But that takes us to the essential point about the central theme of this session, about media and democracy. If we move from the micro to the macro, if we lift our gaze from the details of these journalistic dark arts and look at the overall picture, the most worrying feature of the hacking scandal is the way in which British governments were and are entwined with a media oligopoly. Similarly, it reveals the way in which Britain's main police force was compromised by its links with the most dominant force in that oligopoly, namely Murdoch's News International. My natural suspicion of conspiracy theories meant that it took some time for me to accept the claims initially put forward by Nick Davis, The Guardian's superb reporter and a good friend of mine since the mid-70s. But his stories implied that phone hacking had been carried out on an industrial scale by the News of the World, yet they'd been protected from genuine official police inquiry by dint of close personal relationships forged between senior police officers and senior newspaper executives. And then another set of close relationships, that between senior politicians, including prime ministers, and senior News International executives. It took me a long time to agree that Nick had been right all along. It wasn't, in a sense, a conspiracy, not as such. People didn't go into a smoke-filled room and plot. There were no formal agreements. It was much more structural. It was in the interests of all three parties, to do as they did, to scratch backs, to look the other way, particularly at the political level, where there was this desperate need to cozy up to Murdoch in the belief that his newspapers, particularly The Sun, could deliver votes. And that's true for Labour and for the Tories. It's no difference. At the centre of this web was Murdoch himself, enjoying the benefits. As he said, I don't seek out politicians, they come to me. He was at the centre of the web. They wanted the support of his newspapers, and he therefore was willing to do business with them. But also the other problem with Murdoch is that he created an internal climate at News International in which his editors and his journalists were allowed to do more or less as long as they liked, as long as they got results. Now, I happen to believe, some people think I'm naive about this, I happen to believe Murdoch knew nothing about hacking. I think I know him well enough to speculate that had he known, he would have banned its use. But that doesn't exculpate him because he set the corporate agenda. Similarly, when confronted with The Guardian's allegations from 2009 onwards about the widespread use of hacking at the News of the World, he did nothing, or the very minimum, to discover what had happened. He told the Commons Select Committee he was let down by assurances given by people he respected, including, it would appear, his not very clever son, James. He's not been charged, so I can say anything I like about him. Given the grave nature of the ethical and illegal activity and the frequent stories about it, that really wasn't good enough. He even ignored the allegations when they were raised in a superb piece of journalism by the New York Times. And this takes me naturally to the conclusion you've been desperate for me to reach. The hacking scandal is, to an extent, the result of Murdoch's dominance of the media landscape in Britain. It's true that we've had plurality, actually more plurality in the past, we still have it. But one player had grown too large and therefore too powerful. The Guardian editor, Alan Rusbridger, said to Leveson last week, I quote, "The Murdoch influence, power, money, dominance and reputation was such that it seemed to confer a form of immunity from scrutiny. It meant even rival newspapers were loath to take him on. The Guardians were not looking after the Guardian." And that's dangerous for democracy. Equally dangerous, however, it has to be said, is what might happen because of this scandal, what Leveson might decide should happen in terms of press regulation. I'm happy to say he's looked at the Irish model and he seems to like it. It's good and it seems to work well, but I'm uncertain whether it would be entirely suitable in the altogether more volatile, more intrusive British environment. On the other hand, though the government will make the final decision, whatever Leveson recommends, we all fear that the state will take the opportunity to create some kind of lever that puts a brake on press freedom. And the very fact we're in this position is due to Murdoch and his News of the World, in company with several other papers, in having put our freedom at risk. They failed to understand, or perhaps didn't care to understand, that freedom doesn't mean a license to do as you like. Just as Miriam said in the introduction here, it's about responsibility. It embodies the use of freedom, within it a requirement of responsibility. And as we say here in Donegal, Gorigamaga. Thank you.